The night in Winterfell was cold. The wind howled through the stone walls, making the torches flicker. Sansa Stark sat alone in her chambers, her hands trembling. Ramsy Bolton had been cruel to her before, but tonight there was something different in his eyes. Something worse. She thought about escaping, but there was no way out. The guards outside were loyal to Ramsy. Theon, was broken and afraid. No one was coming to save her. Jon Snow did not know where she was. Brienne of Tarth was far away. She was alone. The door creaked open. Ramsy walked in, a smirk on his face. He enjoyed seeing fear in her eyes. "My lovely wife," he said, his voice soft but dangerous. "Are you happy here in Winterfell?" Sansa did not answer. She had learned that words only gave him more reason to hurt her. Ramsy walked closer. "You have been quiet lately," he said. "I don't like quiet." He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "A wife must obey her husband," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. Sansa wanted to fight, but she was weak. She had not eaten properly for days. Her body ached from the bruises he left. She knew that if she resisted, he would hurt her more. "I think you are still dreaming of escape," Ramsy said. "But you will never leave. You belong to me, Sansa Stark." She looked into his eyes, filled with madness. "I am a Stark of Winterfell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ramsy chuckled. "Not for long." Before she could react, he pulled out a dagger from his belt. Her eyes widened. "Let me show you what happens to traitors," Ramsy said. He plunged the dagger into her stomach. Pain exploded through her body. She gasped, her hands grabbing his arms, but he did not stop. He twisted the knife, watching her face, enjoying the terror in her eyes. Blood soaked through her dress. She fell to her knees, choking on a sob. Ramsy stepped back, wiping the blood from his hands. "Now you will never leave me," he whispered. Sansa collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The pain faded as darkness took over. The last thing she heard was Ramsy's laughter echoing in the chamber. Winterfell would never be the same again. Winterfell was silent. The cold air crept through the halls, wrapping around the castle like a ghost. Sansa Stark lay on the floor, her crimson blood pooling. Beneath her, the life in her eyes was fading, but her mind held on to one last thought. Jon. If only he knew. If only he could have saved her. Ramsy Bolton stood over her body, tilting his head like a curious child watching an insect struggle. He muttered, wiping the dagger on his sleeve. "That was quicker than I expected." Reek stood frozen at the doorway. His breath was shallow, his face pale. His hands trembled as he looked at the girl who had once been Sansa Stark, the girl who had begged him for help, the girl he had failed. "Clean this up," Ramsy said, stepping over Sansa's lifeless form as if she were nothing more than a fallen piece of furniture. "And make sure no one hears of this. We wouldn't want to ruin the mood in Winterfell, would we?" Reek swallowed hard. His legs felt weak, but he had no choice. He bent down, his hands hesitating as he reached for Sansa's body. She still felt warm. It was as if she could wake up at any moment. "I said clean it up," Ramsy snapped, making Reek flinch. "Yes, my lord," he whispered, as he dragged Sansa's body across the cold stone floor. Silent tears slipped down his face. He had betrayed her again. He had let another Stark die. Far away, beyond the wall, Jon Snow stood beside, the fire sharpening Longclaw. He had been dreaming of Sansa, a strange dream, one that filled him with dread. In it, she had been calling his name, her voice weak, filled with pain. Blood covered her hands. Jon shook the thought away. Sansa was safe. She was married to Ramsy Bolton, the Warden of the North. He hated the thought, but he had no power to change it. Still, the feeling of unease remained, a shadow of doom lingering in the air. Something was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The cold winds howled through Winterfell, carrying the scent of blood. Sansa Stark was gone. The halls where she had walked, the room where she had wept, all of it was silent now. But silence could not bury the truth forever. Reek, Theon Greyjoy, dragged her lifeless body through the castle's darkened corridors. His hands were stained red, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. He had betrayed her again. He had let Ramsy win. He knew what Ramsy would do next. He would lie. He would tell the Lords of the North that Sansa had run away, that she had abandoned her duty as a wife. No one would question him. No one ever did. But Theon knew the truth. He had to act. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the kennels where Ramsy kept his hounds, starving beasts trained to hunt and kill. The stench of rotting meat filled the air. It was the perfect place to hide a body, but Theon hesitated. Sansa Stark was a Stark of Winterfell. She did not deserve this. Tears blurred his vision. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he heard footsteps. Theon turned, his heart stopping as he saw a shadow moving down the corridor. A flicker of torchlight revealed a face. Miranda, Ramsy's cruel mistress, she smirked. "Bad dog," she whispered mockingly. "What are you doing?" Theon's hands clenched into fists. He could not let her see, but it was too late. Miranda's eyes fell on the bundle in his arms, the pale, lifeless hand slipping from beneath the cloak. Her smirk faded. "Oh," she whispered. Then she grinned. "Ramsy will be pleased." Theon didn't think. For the first time in years, he acted. With a choked cry, he lunged forward, his hands grabbing her throat. Miranda gasped, struggling, but Theon was desperate. He squeezed, his grip fueled by years of pain, regret, and rage. Her body jerked, then went still. Theon stumbled back, breathing heavily. Miranda's dead eyes stared at the ceiling. He had done it. He had killed for Sansa, but it was not enough. He had to escape. He had to tell Jon. Gripping Sansa's lifeless hand one last time, he whispered, "I will make this right." Then he turned and ran. He didn't look back, not even when Ramsy's hounds began to howl. Theon ran through the dark corridors of Winterfell, his heart pounding in his chest. The icy air bit at his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, the castle stirred. The distant howls of Ramsy's hounds echoed through the night, hungry and eager. Someone would find Miranda's body soon. Someone would know Sansa was missing. He had to get out. He had failed Sansa, but he could still do one thing: tell Jon Snow the truth. Theon reached the outer wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could see the world beyond Winterfell, the dark woods stretching out into the unknown. If he could just get past the gates, he might have a chance. But then, a voice behind him. "Going somewhere, Reek?" Theon froze, his blood turning to ice. "Ramsy." Slowly he turned. Ramsy stood in the torchlight, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Behind him, several of his men waited, swords in hand. The hounds growled, their glowing eyes locked on Theon. Theon clenched his fists. "You killed her." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the rage in it was undeniable. "You killed Sansa." Ramsy tilted his head, smiling. "Yes," he said, "and it was quite enjoyable." Something inside Theon snapped. All the years of suffering, of humiliation, of fear, it all built up inside him like a storm. He had spent so long being weak, so long being Reek. But now, for the first time in years, he was Theon Greyjoy again. With a sudden burst of energy, he grabbed a nearby torch and swung it at Ramsy's face. Ramsy jerked back, cursing. Theon didn't wait. He turned and ran. "Catch him!" Ramsy roared. Theon sprinted toward the gate. He could hear the soldiers behind him, their boots slamming against the stone. He had no weapon, no plan, only desperation. Then, a stroke of luck. The gate was open just enough for him to slip through. He threw himself into the snow outside the walls, rolling to his feet. He could hear the shouts behind him, the clatter of armor, but he didn't stop. He ran into the freezing night, into the dark unknown. Winterfell faded behind him. He did not know if he would survive, but he knew one thing. Jon Snow had to know the truth, and Theon Greyjoy would not stop until he told him. Theon ran through the snow-covered forest, his lungs burning, his legs aching with every step. The cold wind lashed against his face, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, the distant howls of Ramsy's hounds echoed through the night. They were coming for him. His mind raced. He had to reach Castle Black. He had to tell Jon Snow what had happened to Sansa, but the journey was long, and he was weak. His body was failing him, years of torture and starvation taking their toll. His limbs felt heavy, his breaths came in, painful gasps. But he could not stop. Not yet. Branches snapped behind him. Theon turned sharply, his heart pounding. He could see figures moving in the darkness, torches flickering. Ramsy's men. They were close. He stumbled forward, pushing himself harder. His feet sank into the deep snow, making every step a struggle. His body screamed for rest, but he forced himself to keep going. Then an arrow whistled past his ear. Theon gasped, ducking just in time. Another arrow struck a tree beside him. They had found him. A cruel laugh rang out. "Run, little reek," one of Ramsy's men taunted. "Run while you still can." Theon didn't look back. He ran deeper into the forest, weaving between trees, his breath ragged. Then, suddenly, his foot caught on a root. He crashed into the snow with a cry of pain. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't move. Heavy footsteps crunched toward him. Theon turned his head, his vision swimming. He could see them now, 3 of Ramsy's men, their faces twisted with amusement. "Did you really think you could escape?" one of them sneered, raising his sword. Theon closed his eyes. This was it. This was how he died. But then a shadow moved in the darkness. A flash of steel, a scream. Theon's eyes flew open just in time to see one of Ramsy's men collapse, a sword buried in his chest. Another figure emerged from the darkness, cutting down the second man before he could react. The third man turned to run, but an arrow struck him in the back. He fell to the ground, lifeless. Theon gasped, his eyes widening as he looked up at his saviors. 2 figures stood before him, their faces hidden beneath heavy cloaks. But then one of them stepped forward, lowering his hood. Jon Snow. Theon's breath caught in his throat. He had made it. He had found him, but as Jon stared down at him, his expression dark, Theon knew. This was not a rescue. This was judgment. Theon lay in the snow, his breath shallow, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Above him, Jon Snow stood, his face hard as ice, Longclaw gleaming in the dim torchlight. For a moment, there was only silence. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the stench of blood from the dead men around them. Theon tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Jon stepped closer. His dark eyes burned with something Theon had seen before. Hatred. "You," Jon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything you did, you dare crawl back?" Theon flinched. He had imagined this moment before, seeing Jon again, facing the consequences of his betrayal. But he had no choice. He had to tell him. "Sansa," Theon rasped, forcing the word past his frozen lips. He killed her." Jon's expression didn't change. He didn't move, didn't react, but the silence was heavier now, pressing down on them like a weight. "Liar," one of the men behind Jon growled. Theon shook his head desperately. "No, I swear it," he whispered. "Ramsy, he—" Jon's fist struck him across the face. Pain exploded in Theon's skull as he collapsed fully into the snow. Blood filled his mouth. "You swore to my father," Jon said coldly. "You swore to Robb, and you betrayed them both." Theon coughed, struggling to sit up. "I know," he choked. "I know. But Jon, please, listen. He killed her." Jon's hand tightened. around Longclaw's hilt. The anger in his eyes was dangerous, barely contained. The men behind him shifted uneasily. One of them, a burly ranger with a scarred face, stepped forward. "If this is true, we need to act." Jon's jaw clenched. His grip on his sword trembled. "How?" His voice was quieter now, but no less deadly. "How did she die?" Theon swallowed hard. The memory of Sansa's lifeless body, her blood staining the cold stone floor, flashed through his mind. His voice cracked. As he spoke, Ramsy stabbed her. He smiled while he did it. Jon's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Pain, grief, something deeper. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, without warning, Jon grabbed Theon by the collar and dragged him up to his knees. Theon gasped, his body too weak to resist. "If you're lying," Jon said, his voice like a blade, "I'll kill you myself." Theon met his gaze. "I'm not lying," he whispered. Jon stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then finally he let go. "Get up," Jon ordered. Theon tried to stand, but his legs gave out. One of the men grabbed his arm, yanking him up. Jon turned away, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, then spoke. "We ride for Winterfell." Theon's heart pounded. This was it. Winterfell would burn, and Ramsy Bolton would pay for what he had done. The snow fell heavy as they rode toward Winterfell. Theon's body ached with every movement, but he forced himself to stay upright. Jon had given him a horse, but not his trust. No one spoke to him. The men of the Night's Watch and the wildlings who followed Jon only glanced at him with suspicion or disgust. But Theon didn't care. All that mattered was Ramsy Bolton's death. Jon led the group in silence, his face unreadable. But Theon could see the storm raging inside him. He had seen Jon angry before, but never like this. His grip on Longclaw was tight, his knuckles white. They stopped at a ridge overlooking Winterfell. Theon's stomach twisted at the sight of the castle's high walls, the banners of House Bolton still hanging from the towers, the place where Sansa had suffered, the place where she had died. Jon stared at it, his jaw clenched. "What's the plan?" Tormund Giantsbane asked, his breath misting in the cold air. Jon didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice like steel, he said, "We take his head." Theon shivered, not from the cold, but from the finality of Jon's words. Inside Winterfell, Ramsy Bolton stood before the great hearth, feeding scraps of meat to his hounds. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, their hungry mouths snapping. Up every piece he tossed, a knock at the door. "My lord," a nervous servant said, stepping inside. "There's been news." Ramsy turned, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's Jon Snow. He's coming." Ramsy's smirk widened. He had expected this. "Let him come," he said, tossing another scrap of meat into a hound's waiting jaws. "Let him see what happens to Starks in Winterfell." Outside the walls, Jon's men prepared for battle. Theon could feel the tension in the air. This was not going to be a siege, it was going to be a reckoning. Jon turned to his men, his voice cutting through the icy night. "No mercy, no prisoners. Ramsy Bolton dies tonight." A roar of agreement rose from the gathered men. The gates of Winterfell loomed before them. The night was about to be painted red. The battle began with a thunderous roar. Jon Snow led the charge, his sword raised high, his men storming toward Winterfell's gates like an unstoppable wave. Theon rode beside him, gripping the reins tightly, his heart hammering. He was not a warrior anymore, but this was his fight. Arrows rained down from the walls. A man beside Theon let out a strangled cry and fell from his horse, an arrow buried in his throat. But the attackers did not falter. They crashed into the gates with a force that shook the ground. "Break it down," Jon shouted. His voice cut through the chaos, filled with rage, with vengeance. The wildlings and the men of the Night's Watch slammed a battering ram against the wooden doors. Again and again. The gate groaned under the pressure. Inside the castle, Ramsy Bolton stood on the battlements, watching with an amused smirk. He turned to his captain. "They're eager, aren't they?" The captain hesitated. "My lord, perhaps we should—" Ramsy silenced him with a glare. "Let them come," he said. "I want to see the look on Jon Snow's face when I flay him alive." The gate cracked, then splintered. Then it burst open. Jon Snow was the first to step through, Longclaw glistening in the torchlight. His eyes burned with fury. "Kill them all!" Ramsy shouted. The battle erupted inside Winterfell's walls. Swords clashed, men screamed, and blood stained the snow. Jon cut through soldiers like a man possessed, his fury unmatched. Theon fought too, though his body was weak. He was not the warrior he had once been, but he still had one purpose: to see Ramsy fall. He moved through the chaos, searching for him. Then across the courtyard, he saw him. Ramsy stood on the steps of the great hall, his dagger gleaming, his smirk unwavering. He was waiting. Jon saw him too. Their eyes locked. Ramsy grinned. "Come on, bastard," he taunted. Jon didn't hesitate. He charged, his sword raised. Ramsy darted back, dodging the first strike. He was fast, laughing as he moved. "Oh, you're angry," he sneered. "Good. That makes this fun." Jon swung again. This time his blade sliced across Ramsy's cheek. The smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl. He lunged, slashing with his dagger. Jon blocked it, but Ramsy was quick, spinning away before Jon could strike again. "Do you know how she screamed, Jon?" Ramsy said, circling him. "Do you know how she begged?" Jon roared, his rage exploding. He swung again. This time he did not miss. His sword drove deep into Ramsy's side. Ramsy gasped, his eyes wide. Blood soaked his fine clothes. He stumbled, but Jon didn't let him fall. He grabbed him by the collar and dragged him forward, his face inches from Ramsy's. "You die tonight," Jon whispered. Then he threw him to the ground. Theon stepped forward, his breath shaking. Jon turned. To him. Their eyes met, and for the first time Theon saw something different in Jon's gaze. Not hatred, not anger, understanding. Jon nodded. "Finish it." Theon hesitated. Then he stepped toward Ramsy. Ramsy, the monster of Winterfell, the man who had stolen everything from him, was now on his knees, bleeding, powerless. "Reek," Ramsy murmured, laughing weakly. "You're still Reek." Theon clenched his fists. "No," he whispered, "not anymore." He grabbed a fallen sword, and he drove it through Ramsy Bolton's heart. Ramsy gasped. His smirk faded. The light in his eyes flickered. Then he was gone. Theon stepped back, his breath unsteady. The courtyard was silent. Winterfell was free, but Sansa was gone, and no victory could bring her back. As Jon stood in the falling snow, looking down at Ramsy's lifeless body, he felt no joy, only grief. The battle was won. But the war had cost too much, and Winterfell would never be the same again.